The armistice was supposed to end a war that had never quite become one. For 9 years the Kessine Suzerainty and the Terran conquered had circled each other along the pale seam of contested space that human charts called the Verge. There had been skirmishes there and lost freighters, and a few ugly hours near the Coriat Drift when two patrol groups mistook posture for intent and traded fire until both limped home. But there had been no true battle, no world burned, no fleet broken. Both sides had spent 9 years learning to fear the other without ever learning what the other could actually do. That, in the end, was the mistake that killed a great many people. Commander Ren Adami was 28 years old the day she flew into that mistake, and she did not yet know it was a mistake. She knew only that she had been given the finest posting of her short life, and that she intended not to disgrace it. She had come up fast, faster than was comfortable for the older officers who watched her do it. She had graduated the Vigil Academy at Ceres with the kind of marks that made instructors argue about her in the mess, and she had spent the years since on the frontier cutters, running interdiction and rescue along the Verge, learning the cold arithmetic of the deep the way a sailor learns weather. She was not a warrior by temperament. She had never killed anyone. She flew salvage and shepherded convoys, and once spent 40 hours in a failing suit cutting 3 miners out of a crushed ore hauler, because the automated systems had given them up for dead, and she had refused to. That was the reputation that reached the speaker's staff, not that she was fierce, that she did not let go. So when the Conquered assembled its honor delegation for the Coriat Summit, Ren was chosen to command the speaker's close escort. It was a ceremonial command wrapped around a real one. Her flight of 6 Vigil-class cutters would ride the speaker's transport into Kessine space, dock at the neutral station the Suzerainty had offered, and stand watch while the 2 oldest enemies in this arm of the galaxy signed their names to a peace neither had believed was possible a year before. The speaker was a man named Idris Calderon. He was old enough to be her grandfather, and he treated her, from the first hour, as though she were a colleague whose good opinion he needed. That was his gift, and it was the reason a fractured, argumentative Earth had elected him 3 times to speak in its name. Calderon did not command. He convinced. He had spent 40 years talking angry people out of the worst versions of themselves, and he had come to the Coriat Summit believing, genuinely, that he could do it one more time on the largest scale of his life. He told Ren as much on the transit out, standing beside her at the observation rail while the stars smeared into the tunnel of the jump. "I know what they say about the Kess," he said. "I've read every threat assessment your admirals have written, but I've also sat across a table from Suzerain V. Haler's envoys for 2 years now, and I'll tell you what I believe, Commander. I believe they are as tired of this as we are. I believe fear is a habit and habits can be broken. That's what I'm going out here to do, break a 9-year habit." "And if you're wrong, sir?" Ren asked. She asked it gently because she liked him, but she asked it because it was her job to ask it. Calderon smiled at her without turning from the window. "Then I'll be wrong in the most public way a man can be, and you'll fly me home and we'll all be exactly as afraid as we were before. But I don't think I'm wrong. Do you know how you can tell when an enemy wants to stop? They agree to be watched. V. Haler agreed to everything. Neutral ground, our own escort, open channels. A man planning treachery doesn't invite witnesses." Ren had thought about that sentence many times in the years that followed. Do you know how you can tell when an enemy wants to stop? She had been young enough then to find it reassuring. The neutral station hung at the edge of the Coriat Drift like a chandelier of gray stone, a Kessine construction of interlocking rings that turned slowly against a backdrop of dust and dying light. It was beautiful in the way that everything the Kess built was beautiful, which was to say deliberately, at scale, with a coldness that read as elegance until you stood inside it and felt how little of it had been made for anyone to be comfortable. The Kess were tall, longer-limbed than humans, their faces narrow and still, their voices soft and layered as though each of them spoke with 2 throats. They received the human delegation with immaculate protocol, Every gesture was correct. Every corridor was lit. Ren's flight was given a berth, her people were given quarters, and she was permitted to post a watch outside the great hall where the signing would happen. She should have felt the wrongness sooner. She told herself that for years. But the truth was that the wrongness of the Kess was constant and even, and a human being could not tell the difference between an enemy who was always cold and an enemy who had decided to kill you. There was no spike in the temperature. There was no change in the light. There was only the correctness, all the way up to the moment it broke. The signing hall was a drum of dark stone open at its center to the drift beyond, held back by a field so clear it seemed there was nothing between the delegates and the vacuum. The speaker entered with his aides. The Kessine warcast entered opposite, and among them came the one figure Ren had not expected to see in person, Suzerain Haler himself, taller than the others, his robes the deep bruised violet that the Kess reserved for those who held the power of death over their own. Calderon had negotiated for 2 years with envoys. He had never met the Suzerain, and here the Suzerain was, in the flesh, come to sign the peace with his own hand. Ren stood at the hall's edge with 2 of her people, unarmed as protocol demanded, and watched her speaker cross the floor with his hand already extended. "Suzerain," Calderon said, and his voice filled the drum, warm and unafraid. 9 years is long enough. Let's give our children a different sky than the one we grew up under. Haler looked at the offered hand for a long moment. When he spoke, his layered voice was almost gentle. "You believe," the Suzerain said, "that you have been negotiating a peace." "I believe we've been building one," Calderon answered. "You have been teaching us," said Haler, "how much your kind wants to live. That is a valuable thing to know about an enemy." Ren felt the room change. It was not a sound. It was the way the Kessine guards along the walls settled their weight, all at once, the way water settles before it freezes. Her hand went to her hip out of instinct and found nothing there, because they had taken her weapons at the airlock and she had let them, because that was protocol, because a man planning treachery doesn't invite witnesses. "Suzerain," Calderon said, and for the first time she heard the smallest tremor under the warmth. "Whatever you're about to do, consider what it costs you. Consider the years." "I have considered them," said Haler. "You came to us across 9 years to prove that you could be reasonable. You have proven it. Reasonable creatures can be managed. Reasonable creatures grieve and calculate and decide that the price of defiance is too high. My caste disagreed with me. They wished to strike your fleets and see how you fought. I told them there was a cheaper way to learn what humans are. Kill the one they sent to make peace in the place they were promised safety and watch what they do. If you rage and break yourselves against us, we will know your limits. If you swallow it, we will know you are ours already." He said it the way a man reads a ledger. That was the part Ren could never forget. Not cruelty, accounting. She was moving before he finished. She had crossed a third of the floor when the guard stepped between her and the speaker, and she hit the first of them with everything 28 years of a hard life had taught her, and it was not enough, because there were 4 of them and they were built like the doorways of their own cold halls. They did not kill her. That was deliberate too. They held her and they made her watch, because Haler wanted a witness who would carry it home. Ren would not describe afterward what she saw done to Idris Calderon. She reported it once, in full, to the people who needed to know, and then she never spoke the details again. What mattered, what she made herself say, in the deposition and later before the whole of the conquered assembly, was that it was done without haste and without heat, in front of the flag he had carried across the verge to offer them a different sky, and that, when it was finished, the Suzerain turned to her where the guards held her and spoke to her directly, as one carries a message to a courier. "Go home, small commander," Haler said. "Tell your worlds what happened here. Tell them the Suzerainty extends its patience to those who kneel and its judgment to those who do not. Tell them we have measured your kind and found you fond of living. Living creatures negotiate. We look forward to negotiating the terms of your obedience." He tilted his narrow head. "You may keep your ships. Consider them a gift. You will need them to carry the news." They put her back aboard her cutter with the speaker's body and the 2 aides who had survived, and they let her fly out of the drift unmolested, exactly as promised, because the whole point was that she should reach home. The Suzerain had staged an execution and then handed the survivor a vessel and an open lane, confident to the marrow of what a reasonable, grieving, life-loving species would do with them. It would go home. It would mourn. It would count the cost of vengeance against the value of its own skin, and it would find, as reasonable creatures always found, that the skin was worth more. He had measured humanity across 9 careful years. He had measured the wrong thing. Wren flew the transit home without sleeping. She sat in the cutter's command chair with the running lights of the speaker's transport off her port wing, that transport now a coffin, and she did not weep, though 2 of her crew did quietly in the dark behind her. She had expected grief to feel like drowning. It did not. It felt like the moment in a failing suit when the alarm stopped because there is no more air to warn you about, and everything goes very clear and very slow, and you understand with your whole body exactly what must be done and exactly how little time you have to do it. She had felt that once, cutting 3 miners out of a crushed hull. She felt it now on a scale she had no name for. She thought about the word he had used, reasonable. She turned it over in the dark like a stone. He was not entirely wrong about her people. Humans did grieve and calculate and love their own lives. Humans had spent 9 years hoping this cup would pass. But the Suzerain had made one error that all his careful watching had never corrected, because it was an error about the deepest layer of the thing he studied. The layer that did not show itself in trade talks or threat assessments or the way a species behaved when it still had something to lose. He believed that a creature which loved living could always be made to choose living over anything else. He did not understand that there were things a human being could love more, and that the most dangerous animal in the galaxy was not the one that feared death, but the one that had, for a clear and terrible reason, stopped fearing it. By the time the transit tunnel spat her cutter back into the light of human space, Wren Adami had stopped fearing it. She brought the speaker home to a silence she would remember all her life. The docks at High Terra were built to hold 10,000 people cheering a returning fleet, and 10,000 people were there, and not one of them made a sound. The news had outrun her. The Suzerainty had made sure of it, broadcasting its own account of the summit across every channel it could reach, the message delivered exactly as intended. So they already knew, the 10,000, when her cutter mated to the dock and the ramp came down and she walked out first. In a flight suit she had not changed in 4 days, carrying nothing, because there was nothing in her hands to carry. Behind her they brought the speaker. The silence held while the honor detail took him. It held while the assembly's officers came forward, faces gray, and while the admirals she had only ever seen on briefing feeds stood among the crowd like ordinary mourners, because that day there was no rank higher than grief. It held that vast silence, right up until Wren reached the end of the ramp and stopped, because her legs would not carry her past the place where the crowd began, and an old woman near the front. No one, someone's grandmother, a face Wren never learned, reached out and took her hand. And the old woman said, not loudly, but in the dead quiet everyone heard it, "What did they think we would do?" It was not a wail. It was a real question, asked the way engineers ask questions, the way Wren's own instructors had taught her to ask them, as the first step of solving something. What did they think we would do? It moved through the silent crowd like a current through water. Wren felt it pass her and go on, from that old woman to the man beside her and outward, 10,000 people turning the same question over at once, and she understood that the Suzerain's message had arrived, and had been received, and had been answered in the space of a single sentence by someone who had never held a weapon in her life. They had not sent home a grieving witness, they had sent home a fuse. The conquered assembly convened in emergency session that night, and Commander Ren Adami, 28 years old, was called to speak first, because she was the only one who had been in the room. She stood before the assembled government of Earth and its colonies, and she told them, plainly and without ornament, what the Suzerain had said and what he had done, and what he had believed about them when he sent her home. She told them about the word reasonable, and the ledger, and the gift of the ships. She did not tell them what to do. That was not her place, and in any case it did not need saying. When she finished, there was a long quiet in the great chamber, the second great quiet of that terrible day. Then the eldest of the assembly's admirals, a woman named Suk, who had commanded the Verge patrols for 20 years and had spent all of them arguing for restraint, rose slowly from her seat. She looked older than she had that morning. She looked, Ren thought, like someone setting down a weight she had carried a very long way and had just discovered she no longer needed. For 20 years, Admiral Suk said, I have told this body that our fleets exist so that we will never have to use them. I have been proud of that. I have called it wisdom. She paused. The Suzerain believes that wisdom is weakness and that a species which builds shields does not know how to build swords. He believes he has measured us. Her voice did not rise, and that was the terrible thing about it. I have spent my life keeping the sword in its sheath because I feared what it would do. I no longer fear it. I know exactly what it will do, and I find tonight that I want him to know too. She turned, and she looked down from the dais to where Ren stood, small in the great room, in a flight suit 4 days worn. Commander Adami, Admiral Suk said, you brought our speaker home. Will you help us bring him an answer? And Ren Adami, who did not let go, said the only word there was. Yes. The answer took 3 months to build, and it began not with a shipyard but with a doctrine, and the doctrine began in a small gray room where 11 people argued for 11 days about who, exactly, humanity intended to kill. Ren was in that room. She had expected, when Admiral Suk asked for her, to be handed back to a cutter and pointed at the frontier. Instead, she was pulled into the planning cell, the innermost circle of the war that had not yet been named, and she understood after the first day why. Everyone else in that room was a strategist, an admiral, an engineer, a minister. She was the only one who had stood in the drum of dark stone and heard the Suzerain read his ledger. When the debate turned cold and clean and started to slide, as such debates always slid, toward the easy arithmetic of total war, Ren was the one they turned to, because she was the memory of what this was actually about. The easy path was laid out on the first morning, and it was seductive precisely because it was simple. The Suzerainty had struck at the highest symbol humanity possessed. Answer in kind. Find their worlds, find their populations, find the soft, undefended cities that every empire keeps behind its fleets, and make the Suzerain learn on his own flesh what it costs to murder a peacemaker under a flag of truce. It was proposed, that first morning, by a minister whose grief was as real as anyone's, and it was proposed with tears in his eyes, and Ren understood the pull of it in her own chest, because she had been in the room and part of her wanted the whole of the Kessine race to feel what Idris Calderon had felt. She was the one who stood up and said no. That's what he expects, she said. That's the whole trap. He told me to my face, that if we rage and break ourselves against them, he'll know our limits. If we come at their worlds, we come at them the way he thinks a wounded animal comes, blind and screaming, and we prove every word he said about us. He measured us as reasonable. If we become the thing he's ready for, we hand him the war he wants to fight on the ground he wants to fight it, against an enemy he already understands. She looked around the gray room. And we'd be murderers. He killed one man who came to him unarmed. If we answer by killing millions who never held a weapon, then he was right about us, just wrong about which direction. I won't help build that. I'll resign first, and I'll say why. It was Admiral Suk who caught the thread and pulled it into doctrine. Then we do the opposite, Suk said slowly. Everything he expects, we invert. He expects rage, we give him precision. He expects us to strike the soft things because they're easy and they hurt. We leave every soft thing untouched and strike the hard things because they're what actually threaten us. He built a war cast. He built battle fleets, the iron choirs, the talons, whatever poetry they use for them. Those fleets are the hand that did this. Those fleets are the instrument by which the suzerainty imposes its judgment on anyone who won't kneel. She set both hands flat on the table. So we take the hand. We find every war fleet the suzerainty owns, and we destroy it. And we destroy the yards that build them and the doctrine cast that commands them. And we do not touch one civilian world, one hospital, one grain barge, one child. We make the reckoning so exact that no honest being in the galaxy can call it anything but justice. And when it's done, the suzerainty still stands, its people, its worlds, its ordinary life, all of it standing. But it will never again have a fleet to send against anyone. We don't burn the empire. We disarm it, one battle group at a time, until the word suzerainty means a thing with no teeth. Someone at the table said it couldn't be done. The Kessine war fleets numbered in the dozens. They were spread across 100 light years of the suzerain's holdings. They could disperse, hide, refuse battle, run. Then they'll learn what my commander learned in a crushed ore hauler, Suk said, and she looked at Ren when she said it, and that was the first time Ren understood that her whole life had been a rehearsal for this. Humans don't let go. Let them run. We are very, very good at not stopping. That was the doctrine, targeted, total, and patient. The reckoning, the news feeds would call it when there was finally anything to report. Inside the gray room they called it something plainer. They called it the answer. The building of it was the part the suzerain could never have imagined, because it was the part of humanity he had never been allowed to see. For 9 years the conquered had shown the Kess exactly what it wanted them to see. Patrol cutters, convoy escorts, a defensive posture, a species that built shields. Behind that curtain, humanity had done what humanity always did when it was afraid and had time. It had engineered. The Verge War that never happened had bought 9 years of quiet industry, and quiet industry, in human hands, was the most dangerous thing in creation. There were designs that had never flown because there had never been a reason to fly them, and every reason to keep them secret. There were drive geometries locked in series vaults that could fold a hull through the deep faster than any Kessine hunter could track. There were weapons that had failed their treaty reviews not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well, too surgically, too much like a scalpel and too little like a threat, and had been shelved by the same restraint Admiral Suk had spent her life defending. There were automated production lines, mothballed against exactly this kind of day, that could turn asteroids into warships without a single human hand touching the hull until the crew walked aboard. They woke all of it up. Ren spent those 3 months moving between the planning cell and the yards, and she watched her species do the thing it did best, which was to take an unbearable feeling and turn it into an unstoppable machine. She watched the great mothballed foundries at the Kuiper edge come alight one by one, and she watched hulls take shape in them at a rate that would have seemed like fantasy to any observer who had spent 9 years believing humans built only shields. The new ships were not beautiful the way the Kessine station had been beautiful. They were ugly, purposeful, honest. They looked like tools. The largest of them, the strike carriers, were slab-sided and dark and bristling with the folded lattices of weapons that would only unfold once. The smallest, the hunters, were barely more than a drive and a sensor suite and a single terrible gun, built to find things that did not want to be found, and to hold onto them across the deep the way Ren had once held onto a failing suit, by refusing, at a level below thought, to release. There was a moment, in the 2nd month, that Ren carried with her for the rest of the campaign. She had gone down to one of the Woken foundries at the Kuiper edge to inspect the first of the Hunter-class hulls, and she found the yard crews not celebrating, not boasting, but working in a silence that reminded her of the docks at High Terra on the day she brought the speaker home. She asked the yard chief, an older woman with burns on her hands and a photograph of two children clipped inside her helmet. Why the floor was so quiet when they were building the fastest warships the species had ever made. The chief looked at her for a long moment and said that nobody down here wanted to be proud of it. That was the phrase she used. Nobody wants to be proud of it. We'll build you every ship you need, Commander, and we'll build them right, and we won't sleep until they're done. But when this is over, we'd all rather have never had to. Ren understood, standing on that quiet floor, that this was the thing the Suzerain had never once glimpsed through his years of watching, that humanity was pouring the whole of its grief and its genius into an instrument of reckoning and hating every hour of the work, and that a species which hated building weapons and built them anyway flawlessly, without pause, out of sheer refusal to let a murder stand, was infinitely more dangerous than one that loved the work. Love could be sated. This could not. She thanked the yard chief, and she never forgot her, and she thought of the woman's burned hands every time she gave an order that spent the ships those hands had made. She learned the weapons the way she had once learned weather. The lance batteries that could open a capital hull along a seam from 40,000 kilometers, cold and silent, no flash, just a line of ruin appearing where an instant before there had been armor. The swarm racks that vomited thousands of small autonomous killers, each one dumb alone and lethal in concert, built to saturate the point defense of a Kessine battle choir until something got through. The folding drives that let a strike group arrive not on the edge of an enemy formation, but inside it, in the heart of a fleet that believed itself 100 light seconds from any threat. Every one of these things had existed, in principle, for years. Every one of them had been kept sheathed by human restraint. The Suzerain had mistaken the sheath for the absence of a blade. And through it all, the doctrine held. Ren made it hold. She was given, in the second month, a command that stunned her when it was offered and that she came to understand was inevitable. The lead strike group of the entire campaign, the spearpoint that would open the reckoning and set the terms of everything that followed. Admiral Suk would command the war entire from High Terra, but the war would be fought at the edge of a folding drive by young officers who could make decisions in the half-second the deep allowed. And of all the young officers in the fleet, there was one who had been in the room, who carried the grief that kept the doctrine honest, and who did not let go. "You'll be the one they see first," Suk told her, the night before the group deployed. The two of them stood in an observation blister at the Kuiper yards, watching Ren's ships hang in the dark, fueled and silent. "You'll set the pattern. Every fleet after yours will meet the reckoning the way you teach the first one to expect it. So I need you to understand what you are, Commander. You are not revenge. Anyone can be revenge. Revenge is what he's braced for. You are the proof that he was wrong, that a species can love its own life and still choose, clear-eyed, to do the necessary terrible thing, and do it with such control that not one innocent dies for it. That control is the message. The precision is the message. If you ever, in the heat of it, forget that and burn something you shouldn't, you don't just kill people who don't deserve it. You lose the war because you make him right." She turned from the window. "Can you carry that?" Ren thought about the drum of dark stone, and the ledger and the old woman's hand at the docks. What did they think we would do? "I've been carrying it since Koryat," she said. "This is just where I set it down." The strike group deployed the next morning under a name Ren had chosen herself and had insisted on over the objections of officers who wanted something fiercer. She named the group Vigil, after the cutters she had flown as a girl learning the deep, and after the watch her flight had stood outside the drum where it all went wrong. It was not a fierce name. It was a promise. It meant we are watching and we do not sleep and we do not stop. They folded out past the verge in the dark of a manufactured night, 12 ships where the Kessine censors expected none, and they went looking for the first of the Suzerain's war fleets. They knew where to look. That was the other thing 9 years of quiet had bought, not just ships, but eyes. The Concord's intelligence corps had spent the better part of a decade mapping the Suzerainty's military architecture, the deployments of its battle choirs, the locations of its yards, the light second by light second choreography by which the iron choirs held down 100 subject worlds. Humanity had been afraid for 9 years, and afraid humans do not sit still. They watch, and they map, and they remember. When the reckoning came, it came with a target list already written, a list that named every warfleet the Suzerainty owned and not one thing besides. The civilian worlds were on a different list. That list had a single word at the top of it, in Wren's own hand, because she had asked to be the one to write it. The word was untouched. The first fleet on the target list was the 9th Choir, and it rode at anchor in the Suzerain system, 40 ships strong, guarding the approach to one of the Suzerainty's oldest shipyards. The Kess believed it was the safest posting in their space, deep inside their own holdings, 100 light-years from the verge and the timid human cutters that patrolled it. The 9th Choir had not gone to full alert in 6 years. Its crews rotated planetside on the third world of Suzerain, a green civilian world of 1 billion Kessine souls, and it was that proximity. The fleet anchored so close to a living world that its commanders believed made it untouchable. Surely even a grieving enemy would not risk a green world of 1 billion innocents to reach a fleet. Surely. Wren studied the Suzerain system for 6 hours from the dark at its edge, her 12 ships cold and silent, drives folded, sensors drinking in every emission the 9th Choir made. She watched the great warships swing at their anchors. She watched the civilian traffic move between the fleet and the green world, shuttles and barges, ordinary life going on beneath the guns. She watched and she planned, and the planning was not about how to destroy 40 ships. 40 ships was the easy part. The planning was about how to destroy 40 ships and not put a single scratch on the world of 1 billion souls hanging so close behind them. That was the hard part. That was the whole art of the thing they had built. It could be done. She had run it 40 times in the simulators at the Kuiper yards, and her weapons officers had run it 40 more, and the answer was always the same. It could be done, if the strike was fast enough and exact enough that the battle was over before any wreckage could fall out of orbit and burn a city. It could be done by ships that arrived inside the fleet, not outside it, so that every shot was fired inward and downward and away from the green world, into the anchored hulls, along lines that ended in vacuum and never in air. It could be done by a strike group that treated the safety of 1 billion enemy civilians as the first constraint of the engagement, and the destruction of 40 warships as the thing it did within that constraint. It could be done by humans who did not let go, and who had decided, in a small gray room, that the whole meaning of what they were about to do lived in the difference between the things they would destroy and the things they would refuse to touch. Wren gave the order to arm the folding drives in the 18th hour, and her 12 ships woke from the dark, and the deep around the 9th Choir shivered with the first breath of the answer. Choir Master Suzerain of the 9th had commanded warships for 60 of the Suzerainty's years, and he had never once, in all that time, been surprised. Surprise was a thing that happened to lesser fleets, to the undisciplined and the unlucky. The 9th Choir did not permit it. So when his watch officer's voice climbed half an octave and reported contacts inside the anchorage, Suzerain's first response was not fear but a kind of affronted disbelief, because contacts did not appear inside an anchorage. There was no lane in. There was 100 light-years of Suzerainty space between the 9th and any enemy, and the only enemy that mattered was 100 timid human cutters that had never in 9 years come within 30 light-years of Suzerain. Then he saw them on the great plot, and the disbelief curdled into something he had no name for, because it had been 60 years since he had felt it. There were 12 of them, and they had not come from the edge of the system. They had come from nowhere. They had folded out of the deep in the exact center of his formation, in the one volume of space his entire defensive doctrine assumed could never hold a hostile hull, and they had done it silently, without the vast energy bloom that a Kessine translation threw across half a system. They were simply there, 12 ugly dark shapes among his 40 beautiful warships, close enough that his point defense had no range to build a firing solution before the enemy was already inside it. And they were not firing at Suzerain. That was the detail Suzain's mind snagged on in the long first second, even as the alarms began. He had spent his career preparing for the human enemy his caste had described, the screaming, world-burning animal that would come, if it ever came, for the soft green world his fleet was anchored to protect. His guns were laid, half of them, to defend Suzerain from exactly that. But the intruders had their weapons run out toward his ships, all of them, every lance and rack aligned inward on the anchored choir, and not one of them turned toward the billion souls hanging bright and close behind him. Whatever these things were, they had not come for his world. They had come for him. The first human ship fired, and Choir Master Suzerain learned in a single instant everything about the enemy that 9 years of assessment had failed to teach the Suzerainty. There was no flash. That was the thing that broke his composure more than anything that followed, the silence and the darkness of it. A Kessine lance was a spear of light, a declaration, a thing that announced itself. The human weapon announced nothing. One moment the flagship of his second flight was whole, a kilometer of layered armor and proud crew, and the next moment a line had appeared along its spine, a seam of absolute ruin drawn from bow to stern as though some vast cold hand had run a blade down the length of it, and the ship came apart along that seam in perfect silence, its atmosphere venting into the dark in a slow blossom of frost. No fire, no flash. Just a line, and then two halves where there had been a hole, and the halves drifting apart with the terrible unhurried grace of things in vacuum. And the halves drifted apart along a vector that carried them away from Suzerain. Suzerain saw it, and did not understand it, and then understood it all at once, and felt the understanding as a coldness in his own two throats. The human ship had chosen its firing angle so that the wreckage of its kill would fall outward, into the empty deep, and not down into the atmosphere of the green world. In the first 3 seconds of the first battle of the war, the enemy had killed one of his capital ships and had spent part of its precious targeting margin, ensuring that the corpse of that ship would not become a weapon against 1 billion civilians. Suzerain had been told the humans were animals. He looked at the vector of that drifting wreck and understood that he had been lied to, or that his caste had lied to itself, and that whatever was killing his fleet was not an animal at all. It was something worse. It was a decision. Then the rest of the human ships fired, and Choir Master Suzerain stopped having time to think. Ren fought the battle of Suzerain the way she had once cut 3 miners out of a crushed hull, without heat, without hurry, at a speed that looked from the outside like calm, and felt from the inside like the total absence of everything except the next necessary act. Her 12 ships had translated into the choir in a pattern she had drawn herself, each hull assigned a wedge of the formation and a firing arc that pointed inward and away from the world, and now they executed that pattern with the mechanical patience of the simulators made flesh. There was no maneuvering for advantage. There was no duel. The advantage had all been taken in the instant of arrival, and what followed was not a battle so much as a demonstration, a proof worked out in real time in front of 1 billion witnesses, that the thing the Suzerain had measured and the thing that had come for his fleets were not the same thing at all. "Second flight is coming about," her sensor officer reported. His voice was steady. She had chosen her crews for that, for the steadiness, because a frightened human is dangerous, and a frightened human with a lance battery is a catastrophe, and the whole doctrine lived or died on control. They're bringing their broadsides to bear, firing solution on the 3rd and 4th in 11 seconds. "Take them before they're aligned," Ren said. "Bow on, and watch your down angle, Re. Suzerain is right behind them. Every shot goes into the hull or into the deep. Nothing goes past. Nothing goes past, I." The lances spoke, silent and dark, and the 3rd and 4th ships of the 9th choir opened along their seams and died before their broadsides ever came to bear, and the wreckage of them tumbled outward, always outward, into the empty dark. Ren watched it on the plot and felt nothing she could have named as satisfaction. She felt the way she felt in the last hour of a rescue, when the outcome was decided and only the work remained. A narrowed, exhausted focus, a refusal to relax until the last body was aboard and breathing. Except that here the work was the opposite of rescue, and the bodies would not breathe, and she made herself look at that too, because Admiral Suk had told her that the day she stopped seeing the crews she killed was the day she became the thing the Suzerain was braced for. They were 40 ships and she had 12, and it did not matter, because the 12 had chosen the time and place and manner of the fight, and the 40 had been given none of those things. The 9th Choir died in 19 minutes. Some of its ships fought well. Suzerain's flagship in particular came about with real skill and put out a wall of point defense fire that chewed one of Ren's swarm racks to nothing, and forced her to spend 3 ships and 6 minutes killing what should have taken 1 ship and 1. She noted his skill. She respected it. She killed him anyway from Boan, along a line that carried his flagship's death outward into the dark, and when the last of the 9th Choir's hulls had come apart along its seam, and the anchorage was full of the slow silver blossoming of vented air, Ren Adami did the thing that turned a massacre into a message. She did not leave. She held her 12 ships in the center of the dead anchorage, weapons cold now, and she opened a channel, an old, simple, unencrypted channel, the kind any receiver in the system could hear, the kind the civilian traffic of Suzerain would pick up as easily as the fleet's ground bases. And she spoke, and her words were relayed and translated across a billion listeners on the green world that hung untouched behind her, the world her guns had spent their whole battle refusing to harm. "People of Suzerain," Ren said, "my name is Ren Adami, and I command the ships that have just destroyed the 9th Choir of the Kessine Suzerainty. I am speaking to you so that you understand what you have seen, and so that you understand what is coming and why." She kept her voice level. Suk had told her, the precision is the message and so is the calm. "Your Suzerain, Vhaler, executed the leader of my people under a flag of truce. He murdered a man who came to him unarmed, to make peace, in a place where he had promised him safety. He did it not in anger but as a calculation. He wished to learn what humans would do. He believed we would grieve and count the cost and kneel. He was wrong. This is what we do." The blossoming wreckage turned slowly around her ships. She let it be seen. "But hear the rest because it is the part that matters. Look at your world. Look at your cities, your ports, your children. Count them. They are all still there. Not one of my weapons touched them, not one will. We did not come for you. We came for the fleet your Suzerain built to impose his judgment on anyone who would not kneel, the fleet that was the instrument of the thing he did to us. That fleet is gone. You are not harmed. You will not be harmed. We have no quarrel with the people of the Suzerainty. We have a reckoning with its war fleets and the caste that commands them, and we will conclude that reckoning to the last hull, and we will conclude it without spilling 1 drop of civilian blood, because we are not what your Suzerain told you we are, and because we will not become it." She paused, and when she went on, her voice did not rise, and that was the terrible thing about it, the same terrible quiet Admiral Suk had used in the great chamber on the worst night of Ren's life. "Tell your Suzerain that the vigil has come. Tell him we are watching, and we do not sleep, and we do not stop. Tell him that every war fleet he owns is already dead, and only the order of their dying remains to be settled. And tell him this from me, because I stood in the room where he read his ledger and I heard him call my people reasonable. Tell him he was right. We are reasonable. This is what reason looks like when it has finally decided." She closed the channel. The recording of that transmission reached the Suzerain's court within 3 days. Carried on the same web of relays the Suzerainty used to hold its 100 worlds together, and there was nothing Vhaler's caste could do to stop it, because the Suzerain civilians had already heard it and were already repeating it, and a message 1 billion people have heard cannot be unheard. It reached the court, and it landed among the warcast like a stone through ice, because every assumption they had made about the human enemy was in it, and every one of those assumptions was inverted. They had expected screaming. They received calm. They had expected the humans to come, if they came at all, for the soft green worlds that the choirs existed to protect, and instead the humans had anchored their attack to the safety of those very worlds, and had spent their own tactical advantage keeping 1 billion enemy civilians alive. They had expected an animal, and had gotten a decision, and a decision was so much worse. The warcast did what threatened castes do, it argued. Half of it wanted to disperse the remaining choirs, to hide the fleets across the vastness of the Suzerainty's holdings, to refuse the humans the battles they came for. The other half called that cowardice, called it the beginning of the end of the caste's authority, and demanded that the choirs be massed instead, drawn together into a fist too large for 12 human ships to break, a concentration of force that would meet the next human strike and crush it and prove that Suzerain had been an accident, a fluke, a trick that worked once. There was a third voice in that court, and it went unheard, and V. Haler would remember it later as the only honest thing said in the whole long argument. It belonged to an old strategist of the warcast, a Kess who had studied human transmissions for the entire 9 years of the standoff, and who rose now not to counsel massing or dispersal, but to counsel something the caste had no framework to accept. He said that the humans had told them the truth at Suzerain plainly in a level voice, and that the caste's error was not tactical but a failure to believe. We are watching, and we do not sleep, and we do not stop. The old strategist said those were not the words of a species making a threat. They were the words of a species reporting a fact about itself, the way one reports the boiling point of water, and that the only survivable response was to understand that the fact was true and to act accordingly, to give the humans nothing further to reckon with, to disband the warcast, to sue not for peace, but for the mercy the humans had already shown 1 billion souls at Suzerain. The court laughed at him. A warcast that had ruled 100 worlds could not disband itself on the word of one old scholar reading enemy propaganda. So they silenced him, and they turned back to the only 2 options their pride could hold, and V. Haler, who alone in that room had heard the old strategist and known him right, said nothing, because a suzerain who admits his enemy has already won does not remain suzerain. Suzerain V. Haler listened to both arguments in the high cold hall where he had once told a young human commander to carry a message home, and he understood, with the part of him that had made him suzerain, that both arguments were wrong, because both assumed that the humans could be made to stop by the arrangement of ships in space. He had watched the recording 40 times. He had listened to the small commander's level voice call his people reasonable, and hand the word back to him like a blade turned around. And V. Haler, who was cruel but was not a fool, felt for the first time in his long reign a sensation he had inflicted on a great many others, and had never once expected to feel himself. He felt measured. He had spent 9 years measuring humanity, and in the space of 19 minutes at Suzerain, humanity had measured him back, and had found the exact shape of his mistake, and was now proceeding, with a patience that mirrored his own, to correct it. "Mass the choirs," he said at last, because a suzerain who shows fear does not remain suzerain, and dispersal looked like fear. "Draw them to the Coriat marches. Let the humans come to us where we are strong." And even as he said it, in the deepest chamber of his two-throated heart, V. Haler knew that he had just told his warcast to gather every fleet he owned into one place, so that the thing that was coming for those fleets would not have to hunt them one by one. He had handed a hunter its quarry, herded and waiting. He simply did not yet believe, could not yet believe, that anything in the galaxy was patient enough and precise enough and unstoppable enough to walk into the mass strength of the suzerainty and take it apart. He would believe it soon. The reckoning became, over the months that followed, the most studied campaign in the recorded history of that arm of the galaxy, and every species that studied it came away with the same two conclusions. The first was that it was the most precise application of overwhelming force anyone had ever seen. The second was that there had never been anything in it, from the first fold at Suzerain to the last, that could have been outrun. That was the quality the Kessine warcast could not solve, because it was not a tactical quality but a temperamental one. The choirs could fight and did. They could scatter and tried. They could mass and were ordered to. But every one of those responses assumed an enemy that could be induced to break contact, to give up, to decide at some point that the cost had grown too high and turn for home. The Suzerainty had built its entire strategic imagination on that assumption, because it was true of the Suzerainty, and true of every enemy the Suzerainty had ever fought, and true, the warcast would have sworn, of any thinking creature that valued its own existence. Fights ended when one side decided the price was too high. That was the deepest law of war. The humans did not obey it, that was the thing. Ren's transmission had told the Suzerainty exactly what it was facing. We are watching, and we do not sleep, and we do not stop, and the warcast had heard the words and had filed them under bravado, because in their long experience everything stopped eventually. They did not yet understand that they were fighting a species whose central myth, told to its children in 100 languages across 1,000 years, was the story of the small stubborn thing that would not let go. Humans had a word for it that did not translate cleanly into any Kessine tongue. The nearest the Suzerainty's linguists could manage was a compound that meant, roughly, the refusal that outlasts the reason for it. The humans just called it not stopping. They had built their whole war on it, and it could not be outrun because it did not get tired, and it did not get discouraged, and it did not, at any point, decide that Idris Calderon was avenged enough. The second fleet was the fourth choir, and Ren took it apart at the Haljevit yards while it was still trying to work out whether Suzerain had been a real attack or a rumor. The fourth had 30 ships and a fixed defensive posture wrapped around the shipyard it guarded, and Ren studied it for 2 days, and then folded her group in along a line that let her destroy the fleet without so much as cracking the pressure seals of the civilian yardworkers' habitat that floated 300 kilometers from the fighting. She had learned, by then, to make the sparing visible. She fought every battle so that the civilians who watched it could see, plainly, that they were being spared, that the human weapons which cut a warship in half with contemptuous ease were being aimed, every time, with a care that verged on tenderness, around the soft things and into the hard ones. It was the most persuasive argument in the galaxy, and it cost her nothing but discipline, and discipline was the one thing her people had in inexhaustible supply. The third fleet ran. The 11th choir, hearing of Haljevit, did the thing half the warcast had wanted from the start. It broke anchor and scattered into the deep, its ships dispersing along a dozen vectors to a dozen hiding places across the Suzerainty's vast holdings, refusing to be a target. It was a sound decision. It was, in fact, the only decision that had any chance of working, and it failed anyway, because the 11th choir had assumed that the humans would have to find it, and the humans did not have to find it. They had spent 9 frightened years mapping the Suzerainty's every military artery, and the 11th choir's hiding places were on the map. Ren did not chase the scattered ships across the deep. She simply went to the places they had fled to, one after another, in an order she chose at her leisure, and she was waiting at each of them when the fleeing warship arrived, and she killed it and moved to the next. It took her 3 weeks to hunt down all 30 ships of the 11th choir, and she spent those 3 weeks the way a patient person spends any long task, without frustration and without pause, and at the end of it the 11th choir was gone and the lesson had been delivered to the entire Suzerainty in a form no warcast could misread. You cannot scatter. We know the map. We will simply be waiting. The last ship of the 11th had been the hardest, and Ren remembered it long after, because it taught her something about the war she was fighting that the plots and the doctrine had not. It was a lone cruiser that had run further than any of the others, all the way to a dead moon at the edge of a system with no name on any human chart, and it had shut down every emission it could and gone dark against the moon's cold rock, gambling that a fleet which knew the map could not know a hiding place that was not on it. It was a good gamble. It very nearly worked. Wren found the cruiser not by any map but by patience, by parking a single hunter in the system's silence for 9 days and waiting for the one moment the cruiser's crew, believing themselves finally safe, allowed a reactor to warm past the cold threshold. That was all it took. One breath of heat against the dark, and the hunter had it, and Wren folded in and ended it along a line that carried the wreck away into the deep. She had thought, watching the last of the 11th die against that nameless moon, that the Suzerain still did not understand what he was fighting. He believed he was fighting a fleet. He was fighting a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history learning to wait in the dark for the thing it had decided to catch. There was no rock cold enough to hide behind. There never had been. It was after the 11th that the Suzerain masked the rest. Wren saw it happen on the great plot at High Terra, where she returned between operations to plan the next with Admiral Suk, and the two of them stood and watched the choirs of the Suzerainty draw together across 100 light-years toward the Coriat marches, and neither of them mistook it for the strength it was meant to be. Haler had gathered his surviving fleets, the 2nd, the 5th, the 7th, the great first choir that was the Warcast's own household fleet, more than 200 warships in all into a single vast concentration at the Coriat marches, anchored to the fortified yards and the Warcast's home worlds, a fist of iron so large that no sane enemy would fold into the middle of it the way 12 ships had folded into Suzerain. It was a formation designed to make the human doctrine impossible. It was too big to surprise, too dense to slip inside, too heavily defended for a spearpoint of 12 hulls to survive its center for the 19 minutes a Suzerain required. He's learned, Suk said, studying the plot. He's learned the exact lesson we taught him, and he's built the exact wall it tells him to build. He thinks the whole trick was arriving inside the formation. So he's made a formation with no inside, every ship covering every other, no volume of space in the center that isn't in someone's firing arc. She almost smiled. It's good. It's genuinely good. If the trick were arriving inside the formation, this would beat us. But it isn't the trick, Wren said. No, Suk agreed. It never was. The trick was that we don't stop, and that we're willing to spend whatever a thing costs, and that we've spent 9 years building more than 12 ships. She turned from the plot. He's massed 200 warships in one place, Commander. He thinks he's built a fortress. Do you understand what he's actually built? Wren looked at the great dense knot of enemy fleets gathered at the Coriat marches. The marches, she noted, the same region of space where the neutral station hung, where a drum of dark stone had held the worst hour of her life, and she understood exactly what Haler had built, because it was the thing Suk had predicted he would build on the night the strike group first deployed. He's built a target that can't run, Wren said. He's gathered every fleet he has left into one place, so that we don't have to hunt them across 100 worlds. He's done our hardest work for us. The only thing that was ever going to save the choirs was dispersal, hiding, refusing battle across so much space that even we couldn't be everywhere. And he's called all of it home into one system and anchored it to a wall. She felt the cold clarity settle over her, the failing suit clarity, the everything goes slow of a decision already made. He masked them because a Suzerain who disperses looks afraid. He'd rather lose everything in one place looking strong than survive scattered looking weak. Then we don't do it the way we did Suzerain, Suk said. We can't. He's right that 12 ships can't live in the middle of that. So we do it the other way. We build the answer to the wall. She keyed the plot and the human production figures came up beside the enemy formation. 3 months of woken foundries and mothballed lines, and Wren looked at the numbers and understood the true dimension of what her frightened, industrious, unstopping species had done behind its curtain of shields. He massed 200 warships, Commander. In the same 3 months, we built 400. He thinks he's concentrated a fist. He's concentrated a target for everything we've made in one place, where we can bring the entire weight of the answer down on it at once, and end the war in an afternoon instead of a decade. He looked at Suzerain and learned the wrong lesson. He learned to fear our precision. He should have learned to fear our patience and our foundries, because those are the things that are going to kill him. The plan for the Coriat marches took a month to build, and it was the inverse of every battle Ren had fought so far, and it was still, at its heart, the same battle. At Suzerain she had used a scalpel because a scalpel was what the situation required. At Coriat the situation required a hammer, and humanity had built the hammer in the same 3 months, and the same woken foundries. 400 hulls where the Suzerain had 200, every one of them carrying the surgical weapons that had opened the choirs along their seams. But the doctrine did not change, not by a hair, because the doctrine had never been about the size of the force. It had been about the difference between the things they would destroy and the things they would refuse to touch, and that difference held at 400 ships exactly as it had held at 12. Because the Coriat marches, Ren knew, were not empty. The Warcast's home worlds were there, gathered close to the fortress fleet the Suzerain had built. Billions of Kessine civilians lived within the very system Vhaler had chosen for his last stand, and the Warcast knew it, and had chosen the system for exactly that reason. It was the oldest calculation in war, the one Suzerain had made at Suzerain and lost. Surely even a relentless enemy would not risk billions of innocents to reach a fleet. Surely the presence of the home worlds made the fortress unbreakable, because to break it the humans would have to accept the deaths of more civilians than had ever died in any battle in the history of the arm. Vhaler had built his wall in the one place where he believed human precision and human patience would finally collide, where to be relentless, the humans would have to abandon the very restraint that had made their reckoning righteous, and to keep their restraint, they would have to give up and go home. He had built a trap not for their fleets but for their doctrine. He had found, at last, the place where the two halves of the human answer could be made to contradict each other, and he had gathered every ship he owned to guard the contradiction. And he waited, in the high cold hall, for the small commander to arrive and discover that she could have her precision or her reckoning, but not at Coriat both. He had measured humanity again. He had measured its restraint and its stubbornness, and he had built a wall on the exact seam between them, and he believed, he truly believed, that he had at last found the shape of the human limit. He was about to learn that he had measured the wrong thing a second time, and that the second time would cost him everything, because the thing he had failed to measure, the thing his careful watching had never once shown him, was that a species stubborn enough to build 400 ships in 3 months and precise enough to spare 1 billion souls at Suzerain was also, at its core, ingenious enough to refuse the choice he had built for it. To look at a contradiction the whole galaxy called unbreakable and simply engineer a third answer that the Suzerain, in all his measuring, had never imagined could exist. Ren stood at the plot on the last night before the fleet deployed for the Coriat marches, and she looked at the great massed knot of the Suzerain's fleets anchored among his home worlds, and she thought about a man named Idris Calderon, who had crossed the verge to offer his enemies a different sky, and she thought about the old woman at the docks who had asked the only question that mattered, and she thought about the word reasonable, turned over and over in her hands until it wore smooth. "We're going to do it in front of them," she said quietly, to Suk, to herself, to the plot. "In front of the home worlds, in front of the billions. We're going to walk into the one place he's sure we can't, and we're going to take apart every fleet he owns without touching a single civilian, and we're going to do it where all of them can watch. Not because we have to fight there, because he needs to see us do the thing he built the wall to prove we couldn't." She let out a breath. "That's the message, Admiral. That was always the message. Not that we're strong. He knows we're strong now. That we're strong and we still won't become him. That's the thing that ends it. That's the thing he can't survive." Suk looked at her for a long moment. This young commander she had chosen because she did not let go, and something moved in the old admiral's face that might have been grief and might have been pride and was probably, in the end, both. "Then go and end it, Commander," she said. "Go and bring our speaker his answer." The vigil deployed for the Coriat marches the next morning, 400 hulls folding out of the dark toward the last fleet the Suzerainty would ever field, and Ren Adami rode at the point of it, 28 years old, carrying a grief she had never set down and a doctrine she had never once bent, toward the place where a man had told her to carry a message home, to deliver the reply in full. The Coriat marches had never held so many ships. From the bridges of the massed choirs, the sky in every direction was warships, the 2nd and the 5th and the 7th drawn up in overlapping walls, the great first choir at the heart of it with the Suzerain's own command hull at its center, more than 200 vessels arranged so that no volume of space anywhere in the formation lay outside another ship's guns. Behind them, close and bright and vulnerable, hung the Warcast's home worlds, 4 living planets and their moons and their crowded orbital cities, billions of Kessine going about the ordinary business of being alive beneath a sky that had been deliberately, cynically filled with the entire remaining strength of their empire. V. Haler had spent those lives as chips in a wager. He had bet that the humans, faced with the choice between their reckoning and their restraint, would find that they could not have both, and would break on the seam between them and go home. He watched from the high hall of his command hull as the human fleet folded in, and for the first time he saw its true size, and even a suzerain who did not permit himself surprise felt the cold move through his 2 throats. 400 hulls. They had built 400 hulls in the time it had taken him to gather 200, and they had not folded into the center of his formation the way the small commander had folded into Suzerain. They had done something he did not, in the first moment, understand. They had folded into a sphere, a vast, thin, perfect shell of warships that enclosed his entire massed fleet from every direction at once, above and below, ahead and behind, 400 ships arranged around his 200 like the wall of a bubble around the air inside it. Every human gun pointed inward. Not one pointed outward, toward the home worlds. The humans had wrapped themselves around his fleet in a way that put their own hulls between his ships and every civilian world in the system, so that anything they fired would travel inward, into the enclosed volume, and nothing at all, could pass through the shell to the worlds beyond. It was the most disciplined thing V. Haler had ever seen, and he did not yet understand that it was not the attack. It was only the frame of the attack. The discipline was the setting. The thing that went inside it was something no one in the Suzerainty had imagined, because it required a use of the folding drive that the Kess had never conceived, and that humanity had conceived 9 years before and shelved, like everything else, behind its curtain of shields. Ren gave the order from the point of the sphere, and 400 human ships did not fire. They folded. Not themselves. That was the thing the Suzerain's every instinct failed to predict. The human fleet did not translate its own hulls. It reached out, all 400 of them at once, with a lattice of folding projectors that had been built and tested and never once used against a living enemy, and it imposed a single vast, coordinated fold not on itself, but on the enemy, on the entire mass strength of the Kessine Suzerainty, 200 warships and every hull between them. Seized in one synchronized instant by a technology that could fold a volume of space, whether or not the ships inside that volume consented to be folded. For one heartbeat, the 200 ships of the choirs sat anchored among their home worlds, bright and dense and sure. In the next heartbeat they were gone. The billions on the 4 living worlds looked up, those who happened to be looking, in the ordinary way of ordinary afternoons, and saw the sky empty itself. 200 warships that had filled the heavens vanished between one breath and the next, folded whole out of the marches and away, translated in a single coordinated act across 4 light towers of empty deep to a rendezvous the humans had chosen, A barren volume of vacuum with no world, no station, no living thing within light towers in any direction. The Suzerain's entire fleet was ripped away from the civilians it had been using as a shield and set down, all of it, in the one place in the system where its destruction could harm nothing at all. And then, in that empty deep, the human sphere folded in after it and closed around it again, and the reckoning that could not be fought at the marches was fought where nothing living would ever feel it. Ren Adami took apart the last fleet of the Kessine Suzerainty in the dark between the stars, 4 light towers from any world, and she did it with the same absence of heat and hurry she had brought to Suzerain, except that now there were no civilians to protect within the battle itself, because the whole ingenuity of the thing had been to carry the battle away from them. The choirs fought. The first choir in particular fought with the desperate brilliance of a warcast that understood at last that this was the end of it, and for a time the empty deep was full of the silent dark seams of dying ships, human and Kessine both, because 200 cornered warships are dangerous even to 400, and Ren spent ships, and she spent crews, and she made herself watch every one of them go the way Suk had taught her, so that she would never mistake what she was doing for anything clean. But the outcome had been decided the instant the fold closed. The Suzerain had massed his strength to make a wall, and the humans had lifted the wall off its foundation and moved it somewhere it could hurt no one, and now they reduced it hull by hull with the patient, unstoppable, unhurried thoroughness that had been the shape of the whole war. The second choir died. The fifth died. The seventh died. The great first choir, the household fleet of the warcast, the fleet that had carried the guards who held a young commander and made her watch, died last and hardest, and when it was nearly gone, when there were 9 hulls of it left, and then 5, and then 1, Ren gave the order that surprised her own crews, the order she had decided on a month before at the plot at High Terra and had told no one. "Cease fire on the command hull," she said. "Disarm it, take its drives and its guns and leave the rest. I want it alive." Suzerain V-Hailer's command hull drifted in the empty deep, its weapons opened along their seams by human lances that had cut with a surgeon's exactness, its drive stilled, its hull otherwise whole, its crew otherwise breathing. It could not fight. It could not run. It could not do anything at all except receive the channel that Ren opened to it, the same old, simple, unencrypted channel she had used at Suzerain, so that everything said across it would be heard and recorded and carried, in time, to every world of the Suzerainty and beyond. "Suzerain V-Hailer," Ren said. "My name is Ren Adami. We met once, in a drum of dark stone at the Coriat Marches, a few light towers from where your fleet is dying. You told me to carry a message home. I did. This is the reply." There was a silence across the channel. When V-Hailer answered, his layered voice was not gentle now. It was the voice of a being who has watched 200 warships die and has finally, wholly, understood the creature he had chosen to teach a lesson. "You have destroyed every fleet I own," the Suzerain said. It was not a question. Every choir, the whole strength of the Suzerainty, 60 years of building, gone in an afternoon. "Every fleet you own," Ren agreed. "The 9th at Suzerain, the 4th at Haljavet, the 11th ship by ship wherever it hid, the 2nd, the 5th, the 7th, and your own first choir here in the dark where they could hurt no one. Every war fleet the Suzerainty ever fielded is wreckage now, and you will never build another before the galaxy remembers that you can be broken. That is done. That is finished. The instrument you used to impose your judgment on anyone who would not kneel, it does not exist anymore." "Then finish it," V-Hailer said, and there was no fear in it, only the flat exhaustion of a being at the end of a wager he has wholly lost. "I ordered the murder of your speaker. I read the ledger to your commander's face. If your reckoning has any honesty in it, it ends with me. Fire." And Ren Adami, 28 years old, who had stood in the room and heard him do it, did the hardest thing of the entire war. "No," she said. "No," she said again, into the silence that followed, because she could feel him not understanding, and she needed him to understand, and she needed the billions who would one day hear this to understand. You measured us, Suzerain, twice. The first time you decided we were reasonable creatures who would kneel to keep our lives, and you were wrong, and it cost you your fleets. The second time you decided we were relentless creatures who would burn your worlds to reach those fleets, and you were wrong again, and it cost you the last chance you had to be right about anything. You gathered billions of your own people under your ships to make us choose between our vengeance and our decency, because you could not imagine a creature that would refuse the choice. Look at your worlds, Suzerain. Look at them on whatever screen you have left. Count them. They are all still there. Not one of them was touched. We lifted your fleet off of them and carried it 4 light towers into empty space and destroyed it where nothing living would feel it, and your billions are alive tonight, every one of them, because we decided they would be. The command hull drifted, silent in the dark. You gave me a ship, Ren said, and an open lane, and you told me to carry the news home because you were certain of what a reasonable, grieving, life-loving species would do with them. I am giving you the same. Your hull still holds air. We will restore 1 drive, 1 enough to limp home, not enough to run and not enough to fight. And you will carry the news, Suzerain, exactly as I carried yours. You will go back to your court and your worlds, and you will tell them what happened here. Tell them the Suzerainty has no fleets. Tell them the humans came for the warcast and the warcast alone, and spared every civilian soul in the reach of their guns, at Saravant and at Haljavet and here at the end of everything. Tell them we could have folded your worlds into the dark as easily as we folded your fleet, and that we did not, and that the reason we did not is the whole of the message. And tell them, and here at last her voice changed, not louder, never louder but lower and slower, and carrying the weight of a drum of dark stone in an old woman's hand and a coffin off her port wing across the transit home. Tell them that you called us reasonable and that you were right, and that this is what reason looks like when it has finally decided, and that it does not stop, and it does not forget, and it does not become the thing it came to answer. Carry that home, Suzerain. You will need the rest of your life to deliver it. She closed the channel. They gave the command Hull 1 drive, as promised, and they watched it turn and limp away into the deep, toward the home worlds it had spent as chips and failed to lose, and no human ship fired on it, and no human ship followed. The Vigil held its formation in the empty dark among the wreckage of 200 warships, 400 hulls that had walked into the mass strength of an empire and taken it apart without spilling 1 drop of civilian blood. And for a long moment no one aboard any of them said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. The thing was done. The answer was delivered, in full, in the only language the Suzerain had left himself able to read. Ren stood on her bridge and looked at the empty vector where the command hull had gone, and she waited to feel the thing she had expected to feel since Coriat, the thing she had built a war to reach. She waited for it to feel like an ending. It did not. It felt like the last body coming aboard a rescue, the moment the alarms fall silent because everyone who could be saved has been saved, and everyone who could not has been let go, that narrowed, exhausted quiet that is not joy and is not peace, and is only the stopping of a thing that has gone on too long. She thought of Idris Calderon, who had crossed the verge to offer his enemies a different sky. She thought that she had not gotten him that sky. She had gotten him something smaller and harder and more honest, a galaxy in which no fleet would ever again murder a peacemaker under a flag of truce and expect a grieving species to kneel. It was not the thing he had wanted. It was the thing his death had made necessary. She hoped, wherever he was, that he understood the difference and forgave her for it. The reckoning was over. It had taken less than a year from the drum of dark stone to the empty deep, and when the full account of it reached the other powers of the arm, the neutral species, the small empires, the watching civilizations that had spent 9 years wondering which of the 2 frontier giants would break the other, they did not read it as a story of human ferocity. They read it as something stranger and more frightening. They read it as the story of a species that had been handed, by an enemy's own certainty, every excuse in creation to become a monster, and had refused, and had instead disarmed an empire without murdering it, and had spared billions it had every reason to burn, and had done all of it with a precision that no fleet in the arm could hope to match. The lesson the galaxy took from the reckoning was not do not anger the humans, though it took that too. The lesson was do not mistake their restraint for the absence of a blade, and do not, ever, mistake their patience for a limit. Commander Ren Adami brought the vigil home to High Terra, and this time the docks were not silent, but she did not stay for the crowds. She went first alone to the quiet hall where they had laid Idris Calderon to rest, and she stood there a long while with her hands empty, because there was still nothing in them to carry, and she told him, in a voice only he could have heard, that the message had been delivered, and that not one child had died to deliver it, and that a species which loved its own life had proven it could love something more and remain at the end of it, something he would have recognized. Then she went back out into the light, 28 years old, to a galaxy that would never again believe humanity built only shields. The Empire had executed Earth's leader to learn what humanity was. Humanity had answered by destroying every warfleet the Empire owned, every choir, every hull, 60 years of building unmade in a single unhurried year, and by sparing every civilian soul within the reach of its guns, and by sending the Suzerain home alive to carry the reckoning himself, so that the whole of the Suzerainty would hear it in the voice of the being who had ordered the murder and lost everything he built to answer for it. And that was the message, not the ruin, the restraint inside the ruin. The proof that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was not the creature that feared death, and not the creature that raged, but the creature that could look at every reason to become a monster, and choose, clear-eyed and unstoppable and exact, to remain something better, and destroy your entire empire's ability to ever threaten anyone again, without once betraying what it was. The Suzerain had wanted to know what humanity would do. Now the whole galaxy knew.